The stagecoach rocked hard over a rut in the road, and Helen Grady pressed her gloved hand against the window frame without flinching, though every other passenger inside had gasped and grabbed for the leather straps. She had learned long ago that fear was a luxury she could not afford, not since the night a burning rafter had taken the sight from her left eye and left a thin silver scar curving from brow to cheekbone like a crescent moon carved into her skin. That was 12 years gone now, and in those 12 years Helen Grady had learned to see the world plainly with the eye that remained to her, and to meet it without blinking. It was the spring of 1875, and the Wyoming Territory stretched out beyond the coach window in long gold and green waves, broken here and there by outcroppings of red rock and stands of cottonwood trees clustered along the creek beds. Helen had traveled by train from Missouri to the railhead at Cheyenne, and from there, by this jostling stagecoach, toward a settlement called Larkspur Hollow, where a man she had never laid eyes on was waiting to make her his wife. She had answered his advertisement in the Matrimonial Times 3 months earlier. It had been a plain, honest sort of notice, not flowery like some of the others she had read aloud with her sister at the kitchen table, laughing at the men who promised silk dresses and pianos to any woman willing to cross half a continent for them. Aaron Townsend's advertisement had said only that he owned 160 acres of good grazing land near the Little Laramie River, that he had a sound house with a stone chimney, and that he wanted a wife who was not afraid of hard work or hard winters. He had asked for honesty in return, and so Helen had written back and told him in her plainest hand that she had lost the sight in her left eye as a girl of 12, saving her younger brother from a barn fire, and that if he could not abide the sight of her scar, he need not write again. He had written again. He had written that a woman who would walk into fire for her brother was exactly the kind of woman a man needed beside him on a homestead, and that he did not care what her eye looked like so long as her heart was steady. Helen had read that letter so many times the creases had begun to soften like cloth. Now, as the coach rattled down the last stretch of road into Larkspur Hollow, she found her hands trembling despite herself, and she pressed them flat against her traveling skirt to still them. The town, when it came into view, was smaller than she had imagined, a huddle of clapboard buildings and one dusty street lined with hitching posts, a mercantile, a livery, a small white church with a bell tower, and a saloon with batwing doors that swung lazily in the wind. The stagecoach pulled up before a low building that served as the stage office, and the driver called down that they had reached Larkspur Hollow. Helen gathered her satchel and stepped down into the dust, and there, standing beside a buckboard wagon with 2 bay horses hitched to it, was a tall man in a gray hat, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. He was perhaps 30 years of age, broad through the shoulders, with sun-browned skin and a dark mustache that could not quite hide the seriousness of his mouth. He wore a plain cotton shirt and canvas trousers, the clothes of a working rancher, and there was a slight hitch to the way he stood, favoring his right leg, that spoke of some old injury. His eyes, when they met hers, were a clear hazel, and they did not flinch or dart away from the scar on her face the way so many strangers' eyes did. He looked at her whole, as though he were taking the measure of the entire woman and not merely the wound she carried. "Miss Grady," he said, removing his hat, "I am Aaron Townsend." "Mr. Townsend." She extended her hand, and he took it in his own, which was rough with callus and warm despite the cool spring wind. "I hope I am not a disappointment to you in the flesh." A corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile but close to one. "You wrote me true in your letters, Miss Grady. I don't count that as any kind of disappointment. A man who's been lied to by pretty words knows the value of plain ones." "Then we shall get along," Helen said, and something in her chest, which had been clenched tight as a fist since Missouri, loosened just a little. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hand steady at her elbow, and stowed her single trunk in the back among coils of rope and a crate of chicken feed. As they rode out of Larkspur Hollow toward the homestead, the town's few onlookers watching from porches and doorways. Helen felt their eyes on her face, on the scar, and she lifted her chin and did not look away from them. "They will talk," Aaron said quietly, guiding the horses around a bend in the road where the river came into view, silver and quick between its banks. "Small towns always do. Pay them no mind." "I have never yet paid mine to talk, Mr. Townsend," Helen said. "Talk never fed a chicken nor built a fence." He glanced at her sideways, and this time the smile reached all the way to his eyes. "No, ma'am, it surely has not." They traveled the rest of the way mostly in silence, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. Helen watched the land roll past, the endless grass silvered by wind, distant mountains still capped with the last snow of winter, and she thought that she had never seen a sky so wide or so blue, not even with only one eye to see it. The homestead, when they arrived, sat in a shallow bowl of land near a bend in the little Laramie River, a low log house with a stone chimney just as he had described, a barn, a corral, and beyond that fields not yet plowed for the season. It was not grand, but it was solid, built with evident care, and Helen felt something in her settle at the sight of it, some sense that here, at last, might be a place to root herself after years of drifting between relations' houses since her parents had passed. "It is not much to look at yet," Aaron said, helping her down from the wagon. "But the land is good and the water never fails, even in dry years." "It is more than I had," Helen said simply. "It will do very well." They were married that same afternoon by the circuit judge who happened to be passing through Larkspur Hollow on his rounds. A brief ceremony in the small church with only the judge's clerk and the blacksmith's wife as witnesses. Helen wore her one good traveling dress, gray wool with a modest collar, and Aaron wore a clean shirt he had clearly pressed himself, a little unevenly. When the judge asked if she would have this man, Helen said, "I will," in a voice that did not shake, though her heart hammered strangely beneath her ribs. And when Aaron said the same words, his eyes were fixed on her face, on the scar and the whole of her, with an intensity that made her breath catch. It was, she thought afterward, riding back out to the homestead in the long gold light of evening, a strange way to begin a marriage, with vows spoken to a man she had known for scarcely 3 hours. But she had not come west for romance. She had come west for a life of her own, a piece of earth to call hers, and if love came later she would welcome it, and if it did not, she would still have built something worth having. She did not yet know that love was already stirring in the quiet, watchful way Aaron Townsend looked at her, in the careful gentleness of his hands, in the low steadiness of his voice. She did not yet know how soon she would come to depend on that steadiness, nor how fiercely she would come to guard it in return. That first night, Aaron showed her to the house, which had 2 rooms, a main room with a hearth and table and a smaller room with a bed, which he insisted she take for herself. "I will sleep in the barn loft until you are ready for otherwise," he said, not meeting her eye now, a flush of color rising above his collar. "I would not have you think I expect more of you than you are willing to give, Mrs. Townsend. We are married in the law's eyes, but a marriage is built slow, like a house. I mean to build it right." Helen felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, an unexpected tenderness she had not anticipated from a man who had advertised for a wife as though ordering seed corn. "That is a kindness I did not expect, Mr. Townsend." "Aaron," he said, "if you are to be my wife, you ought to call me Aaron." "Aaron, then," she said, and found she liked the shape of his name in her mouth. "And I am Helen." "Helen," he repeated, as though testing the word, and something passed between them in that small kitchen, lit only by a single oil lamp, that felt like the first true thread of connection between 2 strangers bound now by law and circumstance, and perhaps, in time, by something more. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that Helen took to with a fierce and steady determination. She rose before dawn to build the fire and set the coffee to boil, and by the time Aaron came in from the barn, chores half done, she had breakfast on the table, biscuits and salt pork and eggs from the 6 hens he kept in a coop behind the house. She learned the names of his horses, a sturdy gelding called Pilgrim, and a spirited young mare called Juniper that no one had yet managed to break to saddle. It was Juniper who first showed Aaron Townsend the true measure of his new wife's courage. He had been working the mare in the corral one bright morning in late April, trying to accustom her to the weight of a saddle, when the horse spooked at a rattlesnake sunning itself near the fence post and bolted, dragging the lead rope from his hands and nearly trampling him in her panic. Aaron scrambled back, favoring his bad leg, cursing under his breath, and it was then that Helen came running from the house, skirts hiked in one hand, and without hesitation climbed through the corral rails. "Helen, stay back," Aaron called, alarmed. But she was already moving toward the frightened mare with slow, deliberate steps, speaking low and even, a sound more felt than heard. "There now," Helen murmured, angling her body so that her good eye tracked the horse's movements while she kept her blind side turned slightly away, a habit born of long practice compensating for what she could not see directly. "There now, nobody is going to hurt you. I know what it is to be frightened of things you cannot help seeing." The mare's ears flicked toward her voice, and her wild-eyed panic gentled by degrees as Helen approached, never breaking her low, steady stream of talk, until at last she had a hand on the horse's sweat-damp neck, and Juniper stood trembling but still. Aaron stared, his heart still hammering from the near miss, at his wife standing calm as still water beside a horse that had thrown 3 cowhands off the neighboring Rourke ranch when they had tried to break her. "How did you do that?" he asked, when Helen finally led the mare to him and pressed the lead rope into his hand. "My father kept horses in Missouri," Helen said, breathless but smiling, a real smile that lit her whole face and made the scar seem, for a moment, simply another line in a face full of character. "I learned young that a frightened creature does not need shouting. It needs someone steady enough to trust." Aaron looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his hazel eyes. "I begin to think, Mrs. Townsend, that I have gotten the better end of our arrangement." "We shall see," Helen said, though her cheeks warmed at his gaze, and she found she could not quite look away from him either. It was the following week that Helen first met Silas Rourke, and she disliked him within the first minute of his acquaintance, an instinct she would later find entirely justified. Rourke owned the largest ranch in the valley, some 8,000 acres running cattle down toward the river, and he had made no secret in Larkspur Hollow that he considered Aaron Townsend's modest homestead an obstacle to his ambitions, since Aaron's land held the best access to the Little Laramie for several miles in either direction, water that Rourke's herds needed in the dry months of summer. He came riding up to the Townsend place on a fine black gelding, flanked by 2 of his hired men, and sat his horse at the edge of the yard without dismounting, looking down at Aaron with the easy contempt of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Townsend," Rourke said, touching the brim of his hat with mock politeness, "I hear you've gone and gotten yourself a wife. Sent all the way to Missouri for one, they tell me, since none of the local girls would have you." "Rourke," Aaron said evenly, though Helen, standing in the doorway with a dish towel still in her hands, saw the way his jaw tightened. "What brings you out this way?" "Same thing that always brings me out this way." Rourke's gaze slid past Aaron to Helen, and she watched him take in the scar on her face with a curl of his lip that he did not bother to hide. "Water rights, Townsend. My herds will need the river by July, and that stretch through your land is the easiest crossing for 20 miles. I'll offer you a fair price for it. More than fair, considering." "Considering what?" Helen asked, stepping out onto the porch before Aaron could answer, her voice carrying clear across the yard. Rourke's eyebrows rose slightly at her boldness. "Considering, ma'am, that a man in your husband's position, with a homestead this size and only the 2 of you to work it, might find the money useful." "No offense intended." "None taken," Helen said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But my husband's land is not for sale, Mr. Rourke, and I would think a man with 8,000 acres could find some other way down to his water than through another man's front yard." A muscle ticked in Rourke's cheek, and for a moment something dangerous flickered behind his eyes before he mastered it and forced a thin smile. A wife with opinions, how refreshing. He turned his horse. You'll reconsider, Townsend. Everyone in this valley eventually does. He rode off with his men, and Aaron watched him go with a troubled expression before turning to Helen. You should not provoke him, he said, though there was no real reprimand in his voice, only concern. Rourke is not a man who forgives being crossed. I did not provoke him, Helen said. I merely told him the truth, which seems to be a rarer commodity in this valley than water. She saw the worry still creasing his brow and softened her tone. Aaron, I did not come 2,000 miles to watch you be bullied off your own land by a man who already has more than he could ever need. Whatever comes of this, we will face it together. Something in his face eased at that, a kind of quiet gratitude, and he reached out, almost hesitantly, and took her hand. I am glad of that, Helen, more glad than I know how to say. It was the first time he had touched her hand without the pretext of helping her from a wagon or a chore, and Helen felt the warmth of it travel up her arm and settle somewhere near her heart, a small flame that had not been there before. Spring gave way to early summer, and the homestead flourished under their combined labor. Helen proved herself capable at every task Aaron set before her, and several he had not thought to ask: mending fences, tending the garden she had planted with seeds carried carefully from Missouri, learning to shoot his old Henry rifle with a steadiness of aim that surprised him. You handle a gun like you have used one before, he observed one evening as she brought down a hawk that had been circling too near the henhouse, the shot clean and true despite the awkward angle her blind eye forced upon her. My father taught me, Helen said, reloading with practiced hands. He said a girl with only one working eye had better learn to make that eye count for two. She lowered the rifle and looked at him. Does it trouble you, Aaron, my eye? He considered the question seriously, as he considered most things, and Helen had come to respect that about him, that he did not rush to easy comfort but weighed his words with care. No, he said finally, it does not trouble me. If anything, I think it has made you the woman you are, steadier and braver than most folks with two good eyes I have known. I lost the full use of this leg at Antietam. He touched his right thigh, where Helen knew now, from the way he sometimes favored it in cold weather, an old wound from the war still ached. Folks used to look at me different too, when I came home limping at 18. I know something of what it is to be looked at as less than whole, when a person is looking at the wrong thing entire. Helen felt something in her chest ache with tenderness at his words. What is the right thing to look at, then, in your opinion, Mr. Townsend? He met her eyes, both the seeing one and the scarred one, without flinching from either. The heart of a person, Mrs. Townsend, always the heart. It was a warm night in June, at the Larkspur Hollow Founding Day social held in the churchyard with lanterns strung between the trees and a fiddler sawing out reels while the townsfolk danced on packed earth, that Aaron and Helen shared their first kiss. They had danced twice already, Aaron surprisingly light on his feet despite his war-wounded leg, and Helen had laughed more that evening than she had in years, delighting in the warmth of the summer night and the music and the feeling, entirely new to her, of being looked at by a man not with pity or curiosity, but with plain, unguarded admiration. Mrs. Prout from the Mercantile had been unable to help herself earlier in the evening, remarking within Helen's hearing that it was a wonder Aaron Townsend had settled for a bride with such a disfigurement when he might have waited for a whole woman. But Helen had turned to her with a serene smile and said, I am entirely whole, Mrs. Prout. I am only missing sight in one eye, which I find requires no more sympathy than your missing two front teeth requires from me. A remark that had sent several nearby women into poorly stifled laughter and left Mrs. Prout sputtering into her lemonade. Aaron had overheard the exchange and laughed aloud, a rare full laugh that transformed his usually serious face, and had leaned close to Helen afterward and murmured, I married the bravest woman in this territory, I think, and perhaps the sharpest-tongued. You had better hope so, Helen had replied, for you will need both, married to a man who argues water rights with Selah's Rourke. Now, as the fiddle music slowed into something sweeter, a waltz that the fiddler played for the older couples, Aaron drew her a little apart from the crowd, beneath the branches of a cottonwood where the lantern light did not quite reach, and looked down at her with an expression that made her breath still in her throat. "Helen," he said low, "I did not marry you for love. I will not pretend otherwise. I married you because I was lonely on that land and needed a partner who could work beside me, and your letters told me you were exactly such a woman. But I find that in these past months, what began as partnership has grown into something else in me. Something I did not expect and do not quite know how to say plainly, though plain speaking is the only kind I am good at." "Try," Helen whispered, her heart pounding so loud she thought he must surely hear it. "I love you," Aaron said, the words rough with the effort of a man unused to such declarations. "I love you, Helen Townsend, and I have for some weeks now, though I did not want to burden you with feelings you might not return, given the strange bargain under which we married." Helen felt tears prick at her good eye, and she reached up to touch his jaw, feeling the roughness of stubble beneath her palm. "Aaron Townsend, I have loved you since the night you gave up your own bed and slept in a cold barn loft so that I might feel safe in a house full of strangers. I have simply been too proud, or too frightened, to say so before you did." He made a small sound, something between a laugh and a groan of relief, and then he kissed her gently at first, as though asking permission, and when she answered by winding her arms around his neck and pressing closer, the kiss deepened into something that spoke of months of careful restraint finally given leave to break. When at last they parted, breathless, Aaron rested his forehead against hers. "I believe," he said unsteadily, "that I ought to move my things back into the house if my wife will have me." "Your wife," Helen said, smiling against his mouth, "has been waiting rather impatiently for you to suggest it." They walked home beneath a sky thick with stars, hand in hand, and that night, for the first time since their strange, hurried wedding in the spring, Aaron Townsend slept beneath his own roof beside the woman he loved, and Helen Grady Townsend understood at last that the life she had come west seeking, a life of purpose and partnership, had quietly transformed itself into something far richer, a life of love, hard won and all the sweeter for the winning. But the peace of that summer was not to last uninterrupted, for Silas Rourke had not forgotten his designs on the river crossing, nor forgiven the sharp words of a one-eyed bride who had dared to speak against him in her own front yard. The trouble began in earnest in July, when Aaron discovered a dozen head of his small cattle herd missing from the north pasture, the fence cut clean through with wire snips rather than broken by any natural cause. He rode the fence line for hours, jaw set, and found boot prints and horse tracks leading off toward Rourke land before disappearing into a rocky wash where tracking became impossible. "It is Rourke's men," Aaron said that evening, cleaning his rifle at the kitchen table with grim, methodical care while Helen stood at the stove, her own worry etched plain on her face. "I cannot prove it not to Sheriff Dobbs's satisfaction, but I know it in my bones." "What will you do?" Helen asked. "Ride to town tomorrow, report the theft, though Dobbs will only tell me what I already know, that without proof there is nothing to be done." Aaron set down the rifle and rubbed a hand over his tired face. "Rourke is patient. He means to bleed us slow, a few head here, a fence there, until we are too weakened to hold the land, and then he will make his offer again, and this time we may have no choice but to accept it." "We will not accept it," Helen said fiercely, crossing to sit beside him and take his hand. "Whatever comes, Aaron, we built this together. I will not watch it taken from us by a man too greedy to leave well enough alone." He looked at her with something like wonder, even now, months into their marriage. "I do not know what I did to deserve a wife with such fire in her." "You wrote an honest advertisement," Helen said, managing a small smile despite the tension of the evening, "and I answered it. That is all the deserving either of us has done. The rest we have built ourselves." The theft of cattle continued through July into August, small enough each time that Sheriff Dobbs, an aging, overworked lawman with too large a territory and too few deputies, could offer little beyond sympathy and a promise to keep watch, a promise Aaron knew he had neither the time nor the manpower to truly fulfill. Neighboring homesteaders, the Hendersons and the Millers, whose land also bordered Rourke's vast holdings, reported similar losses, small thefts that added up to real hardship for families with little margin to spare, though none could prove Rourke's hand behind it, for he was careful never to be seen near the mischief himself. It was Helen who first suggested they might catch the thieves in the act, an idea Aaron initially resisted for fear of the danger to her, but which she pressed with characteristic stubbornness. You cannot watch the north pasture and the south pasture both every night and still keep up with the day's work, she reasoned, as they sat over supper one evening in late August, the summer heat still lingering long after sundown. But two of us taking turns could manage it. I have shot hawks from further than any rustler would dare come, Aaron. I am not helpless. I never thought you helpless, Aaron said. I think you the least helpless person I have ever known. That is precisely what frightens me, that you would not hesitate to put yourself in harm's way, and I could not bear to lose you to Rourke's greed. Nor I you, Helen said softly, reaching across the table to take his hand. Which is why we must face this together, and carefully, rather than you riding out alone every night while I lie awake sick with worry for you. In the end, they compromised. Aaron would take the first watch each night from dusk until midnight, and Helen the second from midnight until dawn, each armed and stationed at different points along the fence line where the thefts had occurred, with a system of lantern signals between the house and barn to call for help if trouble arose. It was an imperfect solution, born of necessity on a homestead too small to afford hired hands, but it was the best they could devise, and for nearly 2 weeks it seemed to work, for no more cattle disappeared, and Aaron began to hope that whoever had been doing Rourke's dirty work had grown wary of detection. He was wrong, and the mistake very nearly cost him his life. It happened on a moonless night in early September, when Aaron had ridden out to check the south fence line during his watch, and discovered 3 riders in the act of driving a small cluster of his cattle through a freshly cut gap in the wire. He called out for them to halt, drawing his rifle, but the riders scattered into the darkness, and in the confusion one of them fired back, the shot catching Aaron high in the shoulder and knocking him from his horse. Helen, asleep in the house, was roused not by any sound of the gunfire, too distant to carry clearly on the night wind, but by Pilgrim, Aaron's gelding, returning alone to the corral without his rider, whinnying anxiously at the gate. She woke instantly, some instinct born of months of careful watchfulness telling her that something was deeply wrong, and when she went to the window and saw the empty saddle glinting in the faint starlight, her heart seized with a fear more absolute than any she had known since the night of the barn fire 12 years before. She did not waste time on panic. She lit a lantern, took up the rifle Aaron had left leaning by the door for her own watch, and saddled Juniper, the mare she herself had gentled months before, with hands that shook only slightly as she worked the buckles in the dark. "Please," she whispered to the horse, to the night, to whatever Providence might be listening, as she swung up into the saddle. "Please let him be alive." She rode toward the south pasture, guided by nothing but instinct and the vague direction from which Pilgrim had come, her lantern swinging wildly with the mare's canter, casting long jumping shadows across the grass. Her blind eye made the darkness feel doubly disorienting, robbing her of the depth perception she might otherwise have relied upon, but she pushed the fear of it aside, focusing every ounce of her attention through the eye that could still see, scanning the darkness for any sign of her husband. She found him near the cut fence line, lying in the trampled grass where he had fallen, one hand pressed weakly against his bleeding shoulder, his face pale as bone in the lantern light. "Aaron!" Helen was off the horse before Juniper had fully stopped, dropping to her knees beside him, her hands flying over him, checking the wound, checking for other injuries, her mind racing even as her voice remained steady, forcing calm into it for his sake. "Aaron, can you hear me?" "Helen." His voice was thin, but his eyes found hers, and some of the terror in her chest eased at the recognition in them at the fact that he was conscious, that he was speaking. "The cattle, Rourke's men. I saw one of them clear. It was Boone Hardy, works for Rourke's outfit." "Never mind the cattle," Helen said fiercely, already working to tear a strip of cloth from her petticoat to bind the wound. "Never mind Boone Hardy. I need you to stay still and let me see how bad this is." The bullet had passed through the meat of his shoulder, high enough to have missed anything vital, but the bleeding was steady, and Aaron had lost enough blood already that his skin had gone waxy and cold to the touch. Helen bound the wound as tightly as she dared, murmuring reassurances. She was not entirely certain she believed herself, and then faced the impossible task of getting him back onto a horse and home. "I cannot lift you alone," she said, thinking rapidly. "I am going to bring Pilgrim back, and we will get you up between the two of us, slow as need be. Can you stand if I help you?" "I can try," Aaron said, and there was something in the grim determination of his voice, even weakened as he was, that reminded her fiercely of why she had come to love this man, his refusal to yield to circumstance no matter how dire. It took the better part of 20 minutes, Helen half dragging, half supporting him as he struggled upright, gritting his teeth against pain that must have been considerable, and by the time she had him settled onto Pilgrim's back, riding double behind him to keep him from slumping from the saddle, sweat had soaked through her dress despite the cool night air. She led both horses at a careful walk back toward the house, unwilling to risk a faster pace that might worsen his bleeding, every minute of that slow journey stretching taut with fear that he might lose consciousness entirely before they reached help. "Stay with me," she said over and over, low in his ear, her arms wrapped tight around him to keep him steady. "Stay with me, Aaron. I did not ride 2,000 miles and marry a stranger only to bury him before the first harvest." "Would not dream of disappointing you," Aaron managed, a thread of dry humor even now, and Helen laughed despite the tears that had begun to slip down her face, relief and terror tangled together in that sound. They reached the house at last, and Helen managed to get him inside and onto the bed, where she cleaned the wound properly by lamplight, grateful for the rudimentary medical knowledge her mother had taught her years before, tending to farmhands injured in thrashing accidents. She packed the wound with clean cloth soaked in whiskey to ward off infection, as she had seen done, and bound it tight, and only when she was satisfied that she had done everything within her power did she allow herself to sit beside the bed and simply hold his hand, watching the rise and fall of his chest in the lamplight until exhaustion finally claimed her near dawn. She rode for the doctor in Larkspur Hollow at first light, leaving Aaron sleeping fitfully, and Dr. Abrams, a kindly older man who had tended the valley's ills for some 20 years, returned with her within the hour to examine the wound properly. "You did good work here, Mrs. Townsend," he said, after cleaning and redressing the injury with more practiced hands. "Cleaner than many a soldier's field dressing I saw in my own days doctoring during the war. He will heal, given rest and no further foolishness on his part, though that shoulder will ache him in cold weather for the rest of his days, I expect." "He will have rest if I have to sit on him to enforce it," Helen said, and Dr. Abrams laughed, though his eyes held real respect as he looked at her. "I do not doubt that for a moment, Mrs. Townsend. I have heard tell around town of the bride who tamed the Rourke ranch's wildest mare and shot a hawk from horseback. I begin to think the tales did not do you justice." Word of the shooting spread through Larkspur Hollow within a day, and this time, with Aaron having clearly identified Boone Hardy among the fleeing riders, Sheriff Dobbs could no longer treat the matter as mere unprovable rumor. He rode out to the Rourke ranch himself, accompanied by 2 deputies, and though Rourke denied any knowledge of the incident with smooth, practiced innocence, Boone Hardy, when confronted separately and threatened with formal charges of cattle theft and attempted murder, broke under the pressure and confessed everything. That Rourke had been paying him and 2 other hands to harass the smaller homesteads along the river, stealing cattle to weaken their finances, and that the shooting of Aaron Townsend had been a panicked accident during a theft gone wrong rather than any deliberate assassination attempt, though the distinction mattered little to Helen, who had held her bleeding husband in the dark and feared she might lose him. Rourke himself could not be directly charged for lack of evidence tying him personally to the orders, a fact that infuriated Helen when she heard it, but Boone Hardy's confession was enough to see him arrested for cattle theft and assault, and the scandal that followed, spreading through Larkspur Hollow and beyond, did lasting damage to Rourke's reputation and standing in the valley. Several of his own longtime hands, uncomfortable with the revelations, quietly left his employ in the following weeks, and the bank in Cheyenne that had extended him credit for his ranch's expansion grew notably cooler toward further loans once word of his dealings reached them. It was not the dramatic justice of a gunfight or a hanging, the sort of ending the old dime novels might have written, but it was a real and lasting consequence, the kind Helen had come to understand the true West more often dispensed than any theatrical showdown, slow and grinding, and delivered through the ordinary mechanisms of law and reputation rather than through violence. Rourke, chastened and diminished, made no further trouble for the Townsend homestead in the months that followed. He was seen occasionally in Larkspur Hollow, always a little more subdued than before, his empire of ambition having been quietly, thoroughly humbled, and eventually, some 2 years later, he sold off a portion of his land and moved east, the valley breathing easier for his going. Aaron's recovery took the better part of 6 weeks, during which Helen ran the homestead largely alone, rising before dawn to see to the animals, the garden, the endless small chores of a working ranch, and still finding time each day to sit with Aaron, changing his dressing, reading to him from the few books they owned, a worn copy of Shakespeare's plays that had belonged to his mother, and a well-thumbed almanac that Aaron insisted on discussing at length, despite her teasing that he cared more for predicted rainfall than for sonnets. "You are managing everything," Aaron said one evening in late September, sitting up in bed for the first time without visible pain, watching her return from the evening milking with the pail balanced easily on her hip, her braid coming loose around her face, dirt smudged on her apron. "I confess I feel rather useless, watching you do a man's work and a woman's both." "You are healing," Helen said, setting down the pail and coming to sit beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead with a gentleness that belied the exhaustion evident in her own face. "That is your work for now, and you are doing it well enough. Dr. Abrams said another 2 weeks and you may begin light chores again." "I have been thinking," Aaron said, catching her hand and holding it against his chest, "that I have never properly thanked you for that night, for riding out into the dark with only half your sight to see by and finding me and getting me home." "You do not need to thank me," Helen said, though her voice caught slightly. "I would ride into darker nights than that for you, Aaron. I think I would ride into fire itself if it came to that, and count the cost worth paying." He pulled her down gently, mindful of his healing shoulder, and kissed her slowly, deeply, a kiss that spoke of gratitude and love and the particular tenderness born of having nearly lost each other and been given instead the mercy of more time. "I love you," he murmured against her lips, "more than I knew a man could love before you rode into my life on that stagecoach with your chin up and your letters full of honest words." "I love you too," Helen said, resting her forehead against his, breathing him in, the scent of him grown so dear and familiar to her now that she could not imagine her life without it. "I think I have loved you since the night you offered me the only bed in this house and slept in the cold barn rather than presume upon a stranger's comfort. I simply did not have the courage to say so until you said it first." "You," Aaron said, laughing softly despite the tenderness of the moment, "are the single bravest person I have ever known, and you tell me you lack the courage for words. I do not believe that for one moment, Helen Townsend." "There are different kinds of courage," Helen said, smiling against his skin. The courage to face a rattling snake or a runaway horse is easy enough once you have learned the trick of it. The courage to open one's heart to another person after it has been broken once already, that is a harder thing entirely. Aaron went still beneath her, understanding dawning in his eyes. Your family, before you came west. Helen had not spoken of it before. Some old wound she had kept carefully bandaged even from him. But now, in the quiet intimacy of the sick room, with autumn light slanting gold through the window, she found herself telling him of the young man in Missouri she had once loved, a farmer's son named Thomas, who had courted her for 2 years before the barn fire that took her eye, and who had, in the months following her injury, grown distant and then cold, until at last he had broken their understanding entirely, telling her plainly that he could not bear to look upon her scar every day of his life, that he wanted a whole wife, not a broken one. He said those words, Helen said quietly, staring at her hands rather than at Aaron's face. A broken one, as though I were a piece of crockery cracked and no longer fit for use. I was 17 and I believed him for a long while. I believed that no man would ever want me whole, that I would spend my life as the maiden aunt in someone else's household, tolerated but never truly chosen. She looked up finally, meeting Aaron's eyes. That is why I answered your advertisement in truth. Not merely for land or independence, though I wanted both. I wanted, somewhere beneath my pride, to be chosen by someone who knew the whole truth of me from the start, rather than discovering it later and finding me wanting. Aaron reached up despite the ache it must have cost his healing shoulder and cupped her face in both hands, his thumb tracing gently, reverently, along the line of her scar. Thomas was a fool, he said, his voice rough with feeling. A fool who could not see past a scar to find the woman beneath it, the bravest, most steadfast woman I have ever had the good fortune to know. I do not merely tolerate you, Helen. I chose you, and I would choose you again 1,000 times over, scar and all. For the scar is simply proof of a heart brave enough to walk through fire for someone she loved. That is not brokenness. That is the finest kind of wholeness there is. Helen wept then, unable to hold back the tears that had waited 12 years to fall, and Aaron held her as best his healing body allowed, murmuring soft reassurances into her hair, and something old and painful in her chest finally, fully released its grip, replaced by a warmth and certainty she had not known she was capable of feeling again. By late October, Aaron had recovered enough to resume most of his ranch work, though Helen still fussed over the shoulder in cold mornings, and the harvest that year, despite the season's troubles, proved a good one. They brought in enough hay to see the cattle through winter comfortably, and Helen's garden had yielded more than enough vegetables to can and store in the root cellar, alongside jars of preserves she had learned to make from Mrs. Henderson, their kindly neighbor, who had taken a particular liking to Helen after the trouble with work, declaring her the sort of steady, sensible woman this valley has needed more of for years. It was in November, with the first hard frost silvering the grass each morning and the mountains beyond the valley wearing their first true snow, that Helen realized she was with child, a realization that struck her with equal parts joy and a fluttering, unfamiliar fear, and which she chose to share with Aaron on a quiet evening by the fire, the two of them sitting close together on the bench Aaron had built with his own hands the previous summer. "Aaron," she said, and something in her tone made him look up sharply from the harness he had been mending, some instinct alerting him that this was no ordinary remark. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "No," Helen said, and found herself smiling despite the nervousness fluttering in her stomach. "Nothing is wrong. I believe, in fact, that everything is very right. I am expecting a child, Aaron. Come spring, God willing, you will be a father." For a long moment Aaron simply stared at her, the harness forgotten in his lap, and then his face broke into an expression of such pure, unguarded joy that Helen felt her own eyes fill with tears at the sight of it. "A child," he said, as though testing the word much as he had once tested her name on his tongue that first strange night of their marriage. "Helen, A child. He set aside the harness and crossed to her, kneeling before her chair and taking both her hands in his, pressing them to his lips with a reverence that made her breath catch. I did not think I could love you more than I already do, and yet here I find myself proven wrong. You are pleased, then, Helen said, laughing through her own tears. I confess I was uncertain how you might take the news, given all the troubles of this year. Please does not begin to cover it, Aaron said fiercely, rising to pull her into his arms, careful still of his shoulder but unwilling to let even that stop him from holding her close. Helen, you have given me more in this 1 year than I dared hope for in a lifetime. A partner, a home, a love I did not know myself capable of feeling so completely, and now a child besides. I count myself the most fortunate man in this entire territory. They spent the winter months in a state of quiet, contented anticipation, Aaron insisting on taking over the heavier chores despite Helen's protests that she was perfectly capable, at least for now, of managing her share, a debate that became something of an affectionate running argument between them, settled usually with Aaron simply lifting whatever burden she had been about to carry herself and daring her, with a raised eyebrow, to object. Until Helen would concede with mock exasperation and a real, warm laugh. The baby came in early May of 1876, nearly a full year after Helen had first stepped off the stagecoach into Larkspur Hollow with her chin lifted and her scar unhidden. It was a difficult labor, lasting the better part of a day and night, with Dr. Abrams summoned from town and Mrs. Henderson arriving to assist, while Aaron paced the small main room of the house in an agony of helpless worry that he later admitted had been far harder to endure than any wound he had taken in the war or from Boone Hardy's rifle. When at last the child was born, healthy and loud-voiced and furious at the indignity of arrival, Dr. Abrams called Aaron into the room, and he found Helen exhausted but radiant, cradling a small bundle against her chest. "A son," she said softly, looking up at him with an expression of such profound tenderness that Aaron felt his throat tighten painfully. "Aaron, we have a son." He crossed to the bed and knelt beside it, gazing down at the small, red, furious face of his child, and reached out with one careful finger to touch the tiny hand that had already curled into a fist. "What shall we name him?" "I thought," Helen said, "perhaps James, for my father, if that would please you." "James Townsend," Aaron said, testing the name as he had once tested her own. "It pleases me very well." He looked up at Helen, at the exhaustion and joy mingled on her face, at the woman who had ridden 2,000 miles on the strength of an honest letter and had given him more happiness in 1 year than he had known in all his life before her. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "For all of it. For coming west, for loving me despite every hardship this valley has thrown at us, for giving me this child. I do not know how I will ever repay such a debt." "There is no debt between us, Aaron," Helen said, reaching for his hand. "There is only partnership and love, and now this small life we have made together. That is payment enough for anything either of us might owe the other, and more besides." James Townsend grew into a sturdy, curious child, and was followed some 2 years later by a daughter, whom they named Ruth after Aaron's mother, and then, 4 years after that, by a second son, Daniel, completing a family that filled the once quiet homestead with noise and laughter, and the particular chaos of small children underfoot during chores. The ranch prospered steadily through the years that followed, Aaron expanding the herd gradually, careful never to overextend as Rourke once had, building his fortune slowly and honestly on the foundation of hard work and fair dealing that had characterized him from the start. Helen, for her part, became known throughout Larkspur Hollow and the surrounding valley, not merely as the homestead bride who had arrived with a scarred eye and an unbowed spirit, but as a woman of considerable standing in her own right, respected for her steady counsel, her skill with horses that no one else could gentle, and her fierce, unwavering loyalty to those she loved. The gossips who had once whispered behind their hands about the disfigured bride, Aaron Townsend, had sent for grew quiet on the matter within that first year. And by the time her children were old enough to attend the schoolhouse in town, most had forgotten there had ever been anything remarkable about her appearance at all, seeing instead simply Helen Townsend, wife and mother and one of the valley's most capable ranching hands, scar and all, exactly as she had always insisted she deserved to be seen. Years later, on a warm summer evening in 1890, with their children grown near to adulthood themselves, James working alongside his father on the ranch, Ruth helping her mother in the garden and kitchen, and young Daniel, now 12, off fishing in the river with the same restless energy his father had once shown as a boy. Helen and Aaron sat together on the porch of the house they had built and expanded together over 15 years of marriage, watching the sun set gold and rose over the mountains. "Do you remember?" Helen said, resting her head against Aaron's shoulder, the same shoulder that still ached faintly in cold weather from Boone Hardy's long-ago bullet. "That first day, when you looked at me on the stage office platform, and I was certain you would find some polite excuse to send me back east on the very next coach." "I remember," Aaron said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, his arms settling around her with the easy familiarity of 15 years' habit. "I remember thinking that I had never in my life seen a woman look so entirely unafraid of a stranger's judgment, and I remember thinking that I had best marry you quickly, before some sharper-eyed man in this valley recognized what a treasure had just stepped off that coach." Helen laughed, the sound as warm and genuine now as it had been in the earliest days of their courtship. "There was no sharper-eyed man in this valley, Aaron Townsend. There was only you, steady and honest and willing to look past a scar to whatever lay beneath it. That is a rarer quality than you perhaps credit yourself for possessing." "Perhaps," Aaron allowed. "Or perhaps I simply recognized from the very first that a woman who had walked through fire once already and come out the other side with her spirit intact was exactly the sort of woman a man ought to build a life beside. I have never once regretted the choosing, Helen, not for one single day of these 15 years." "Nor I," Helen said softly, turning her face up to his. "I came west blind in one eye, Aaron, but I have never once, in all the years since, felt anything less than fully seen by you. That is a gift I did not know to hope for when I answered your advertisement all those years ago, and it remains the finest gift of my life." He kissed her then, slow and tender, a kiss that held within it all the accumulated weight of 15 years of shared labor and shared joy, of children raised and hardships weathered together, of a love that had begun as a practical arrangement between strangers and grown, through patience and honesty and courage on both their parts, into something as solid and enduring as the mountains that framed their valley home. Below the porch, in the golden evening light, James called out to his father about a fence that needed mending before nightfall, and Ruth's voice drifted from the kitchen window, humming some tune she had learned at the schoolhouse, and somewhere down by the river, Daniel's delighted shout suggested he had finally landed the trout he had been chasing all summer. Helen listened to the sounds of her family, her home, the life she had built with her own 2 hands and her own unbroken will, and felt a contentment so deep and complete that it settled into her bones like warmth after long cold. "I should go see about that fence," Aaron said, though he made no immediate move to rise, clearly reluctant to leave the quiet peace of the porch and his wife's company. "It will wait a few minutes longer," Helen said, tightening her arm around him. "Some things are worth lingering over, Aaron Townsend. This is one of them." And so they lingered together, as the sun sank below the mountains and the first stars emerged in the wide Wyoming sky. 2 people who had begun as strangers bound by an honest advertisement and a practical need, and who had built, through fire and hardship and unwavering courage, a love that neither scar nor rustler nor doubt had ever managed to diminish, but only in the end made stronger. The Townsend Ranch continued to prosper in the years that followed, weathering the occasional hard winter and dry summer as all ranches in that country must, but never again troubled by the kind of malice Sela's work had once brought to their door. James eventually took a wife of his own, a schoolteacher's daughter from Cheyenne, and settled on a parcel of land adjoining his parents' homestead, while Ruth married a young rancher from a neighboring valley and moved only far enough away to visit every Sunday. And Daniel, ever restless, eventually took work with the railroad before returning, some years later, to settle near his family after all, unable, as he told his mother with a laugh, to stay away from the valley that had raised him. Helen Grady Townsend lived out the remainder of her long life on that homestead by the little Laramie River, growing old alongside the man who had looked past her scar on a dusty stage platform and seen, instead, the whole and unbroken heart of her. She never lost the fearlessness that had carried her west as a young woman with one eye and an unbending will, and in her later years, when her grandchildren asked her about the scar that still marked her face, silvered now further by age, she would tell them the story of the barn fire, and of the long journey west, and of the cowboy who had waited for her at a dusty stage stop and never once looked away from what he saw. "Your grandfather," she would say, "taught me that love does not require a person to be whole in every visible way. It requires only that two hearts see each other clearly and choose, each day, to keep choosing one another. That is the only wholeness that ever truly matters." And in the golden Wyoming evenings that followed, long after the children and grandchildren had gone in to supper, Helen and Aaron would often be found still sitting together on that same porch, hands clasped, watching the sun set over the mountains they had called home for the whole of their shared lives. Two people who had found, against every expectation, a love story every bit as fearless as the woman who had arrived, blind in one eye, to begin it.